The year was 2009. The base was Camp Pendleton, California, one of the largest and most storied Marine Corps installations in the entire United States. Thousands of young men trained there every single day, pushing their bodies past what they believed were limits, learning discipline, learning violence, learning how to become the kind of soldier the country called upon when things went badly wrong. Marines are not ordinary men. They are built, sculpted, tested, and hardened. They bleed together, eat together, and fight together. They trust each other the way most people trust gravity, without question, without thought. And, in the culture of military bases everywhere, that brotherhood sometimes breeds arrogance. Not malice. Not evil. Just the quiet, comfortable arrogance of men who have never met anyone stronger than themselves. His name was Carlos Molina. He was 39 years old, which already made him ancient by the standards of the young Marines stationed at Pendleton. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall. He weighed 190 pounds. He had graying temples, a calm face, and hands that looked ordinary until you looked long enough to notice they were covered in scars. He was not a Marine. He had never been a Marine. He was something else entirely, something that had no visible uniform, no braggable insignia, no flashy patch on his shoulder that announced what he had done and where he had been. Carlos Molina had served 21 years in the United States Army as a member of 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. What the world calls Delta Force. What the men inside it simply call the unit. He had retired 14 months before that October afternoon. He had taken a job as a civilian contractor, consulting on close-quarters battle training for a private firm that worked alongside the military. That job had brought him to Camp Pendleton for a 2-week training assessment. He was supposed to be an invisible presence, watching, evaluating, writing reports. He ate in the common mess hall, slept in contractor housing, and spent his evenings in the base recreation center because he had not yet learned how to sleep more than 4 hours without waking up. Old habits from old wars. The recreation center had a weight room, a television lounge, a small canteen, and a pool table. It was on a Tuesday evening when Carlos settled into a chair near the back corner of the television lounge with a cup of black coffee and a worn paperback copy of Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men. He was not interested in conversation. He was not interested in company. He simply wanted 2 hours of peace before his body forced him awake at 3 in the morning regardless of what he wanted. The 12 Marines came in at around 7:30. They were all young, the oldest perhaps 26, the youngest maybe 19. They were from the same platoon, fresh off a brutal week of field exercises, and they were loud with the specific loudness of men who are exhausted but too young to admit it. They took over the pool table. They filled the room with noise. They were not doing anything wrong. They were just being young men who had earned the right to be loud in a place where they felt safe. Carlos did not look up from his book. One of the Marines, a lance corporal named Travis Decker, who was 22 years old, 6 feet 2, and built like a man who had never once lost a fight in his life, noticed the older civilian sitting quietly in the corner. Something about the stillness of the man bothered him in a way he could not name. Young men who are physically dominant often mistake calm for weakness. They see a quiet older man and, they feel, somewhere in the competitive architecture of their ego, a need to establish something. To draw a line. To make the invisible hierarchy visible. "Hey, old-timer," Decker called across the room. "You in the wrong place?" Carlos turned a page. A few of the other Marines laughed. Decker took that laughter like fuel. "I'm talking to you, man. What are you, some kind of civilian? You look a little lost." Carlos looked up slowly from his book. He looked at Decker the way a man looks at something he has already categorized and filed away, complete, finished, needing no further examination. Then, he looked back at his book. That silence was the wrong answer, as far as Decker was concerned. What happened next unfolded over the course of about 40 minutes. Not a brawl. Not an explosion. Something slower and more deliberate than that, because Carlos Molina was a man who had spent 21 years learning that the most dangerous moments in life are never the ones you expect, they are the ones that build gradually, that give you 100 chances to walk away, that test whether you are actually in control of yourself or just pretending. Decker walked toward him. His friends followed, loose and easy, the way young men follow each other into situations they haven't fully thought through. "Where are you from?" Decker asked, standing now with his arms crossed. "You work on base?" "I'm a contractor," Carlos said. His voice was even. Not friendly. Not hostile. Just even. "Doing what?" "Training assessment." Decker tilted his head. "Training assessment. What does that mean? You watch us and write stuff down?" "Essentially." One of the other Marines, a corporal named Shaw, snorted. "So you're here to judge us? Some civilian?" Carlos set his book down on the arm of the chair. He laced his fingers together in his lap. "I'm here to evaluate training methodology. It's not personal." "You ever served?" Decker asked. "Yes." "Where?" "Army." That got a reaction. Marines and Army soldiers have a rivalry as old as both branches. It is mostly good-natured. Mostly. But, in a room where 12 young Marines were already feeling territorial and an older civilian had just told them he was there to evaluate them, the word Army landed like a small stone thrown into still water. "Army," Shaw repeated, drawing the word out slowly. "What did you do in the Army?" Carlos paused. It was a brief pause, less than 2 seconds, but it was long enough for a man trained in reading people to understand that the man sitting in that chair was deciding something. Not whether to answer. Something else. Something larger. "Infantry," Carlos said simply. It was not a lie. It was simply the smallest true piece of a very large true thing. Decker sat down on the coffee table across from him, uninvited. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and his face carried that particular expression young men wear when they have decided to push something to its edge just to see what happens. "You don't look like infantry," he said. "Nobody looks like what they are," Carlos said. "You think you could hang with us?" Shaw asked from behind Decker. "I mean, if you were in the military, you think you could handle a Marine training day?" "I don't think about it," Carlos said. "Because you couldn't," Decker said, and now there was a sharpness in his voice. "Not cruelty. Competition. The kind of challenge that comes from a man who has been told he is exceptional so many times that he has started to need proof." Carlos said nothing. "We're doing a hand-to-hand assessment tomorrow," Decker said. "Close quarters stuff. You should come watch. Maybe you'll learn something." "Maybe," Carlos said. The conversation drifted. Some of the Marines went back to the pool table. Decker stayed. He kept talking, kept probing, the way young men do when they sense something they cannot name in an older person and mistake that nameless thing for a target. He asked about Carlos's age. He made comments about contractors being soft. He made one comment about Army veterans that walked the very edge of disrespect, not quite crossing it, but close enough that everyone in the room felt the temperature change. Carlos still did not raise his voice. But he did say one thing, quietly, that made the entire room go still. "You should know," he said, "that you're making a lot of assumptions about someone you don't know anything about." Decker blinked. "Yeah? Like what?" Carlos picked up his book. "Like whether or not I can fight." He turned the page. Decker looked at his friends. His friends looked at him. And, in that shared look, the decision was made the way bad decisions are always made by young men in groups, not by one person choosing, but by the group choosing together, silently, without anyone having to say the words out loud. Tomorrow, they decided. Tomorrow, we'll show this quiet man from the Army exactly what 12 United States Marines are made of. They had no idea, not even a shadow of an idea, that they had just invited to a demonstration the one man on the entire base least suited to be underestimated. Tomorrow came the way tomorrows always do. Like a door opening onto a room that looks familiar until you step inside it. The hand-to-hand assessment was scheduled for 0900 on the outdoor training mats behind the gymnasium building. The 12 Marines showed up in PT gear, loose and confident, some of them still half laughing about the previous night. Decker had told the others more about the conversation, how the contractor had gotten a little full of himself, how he'd said something about fighting, how it would be good to put a civilian in his place and remind him why Marines were Marines. None of them had asked the contractor's name. None of them had bothered to check who he was. That, more than anything else, was the mistake that would define the next 3 hours of their lives. Carlos Molina arrived at 0858, 2 minutes early, wearing plain gray training shorts and a white t-shirt. He had a roll of athletic tape in his hand. He sat down on a bench at the edge of the mat and began taping his wrists with the practiced, unhurried motion of a man who had done this thousands of times. He looked, to every Marine present, like a moderately fit middle-aged man preparing for a light workout. Decker walked over. His confidence was complete and total and entirely genuine. He had been fighting since he was 14. He had won every sanctioned bout he had ever entered in the Marines. He was not a bully. He was simply a man who had never been beaten, and who could not quite conceive of what being beaten felt like. "You actually showed up," Decker said. "I said I might," Carlos replied without looking up from his taping. "Rules," said the sergeant who oversaw the assessment, a man named Okafor who was watching this situation with slightly more wariness than his junior Marines. "No strikes to the throat, no eye gouges, no joint destruction. Submission or pin. You tap, it's over." Carlos nodded. Decker nodded. They walked to the center of the mat. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be talked about at Camp Pendleton for the next 4 years. There is a moment in every fight, every real fight, not the television kind where the person who does not know what they are doing reveals it. It is not a dramatic moment. It is quiet. A half-second of hesitation. A weight shift in the wrong direction. A grip that is slightly too tight, burning energy that should be saved. Trained fighters see it instantly. They see it the way a chess grandmaster sees checkmate 7 moves before the board makes it visible to anyone else. Carlos Molina saw it in Travis Decker before Decker had even finished settling into his fighting stance. Decker moved the way powerful young men who have never been seriously tested always move, with his shoulders forward, his chin up, his weight loaded into his front leg, broadcasting his intention like a billboard. He was confident. He was strong. He was fast by any ordinary standard. In a bar, against an ordinary man, he would have ended things in seconds. Against 10 out of 10 men walking the street on any given day, Decker would have won without breaking a real sweat. Carlos Molina was not one of those 10 men. The first exchange lasted 4 seconds. Decker threw a right cross that had legitimate power behind it, the kind of punch that could rattle a man's vision if it landed clean. It did not land clean. Carlos slipped it with a movement so small it barely looked like movement at all, a slight rotation of his upper body, a turn of his chin, and Decker's fist passed 2 inches from his ear. In the same motion, without pause, without reset, Carlos stepped into Decker's space and applied a wrist lock that torqued Decker's throwing arm into a position the human elbow does not enjoy. The pain was instant and complete. Decker's knees buckled. He did not fall. He caught himself. But the buckle was visible to everyone watching. Carlos released the lock and stepped back to the center of the mat. He had not thrown a single strike. There was a silence on the training mats that had a texture to it. The Marines watching exchanged looks that they would later describe, individually, as the first moment they understood that something was wrong with their original assessment. Decker shook out his arm. His face had changed. The confidence was still there, but there was now something behind it, not fear exactly, but its quiet predecessor. Caution. He reset his stance. This time his chin was lower. He learned fast. Carlos could see that immediately, and he noted it with the professional detachment of a man evaluating not an enemy but a student who was rapidly, if painfully, receiving an education. The second exchange lasted 11 seconds and was more technical. Decker did not overcommit this time. He feinted twice before moving. The feints were good, genuinely good, good enough to have fooled a less experienced opponent. Carlos did not bite on either one. He waited, reading Decker's weight distribution, and when Decker finally committed to a double-leg takedown, explosive and, technically sound. Carlos did something that made Sergeant Okafor audibly exhale. He let the takedown begin. He let Decker wrap his arms around his legs. And, then, in the fraction of a second before Decker completed the lift, Carlos twisted his hips, changed his angle by exactly 30 degrees, and used Decker's own momentum and strength to spin them both in a direction Decker had not planned for. They hit the mat together, but Decker hit it first, and, when the rotation completed, Carlos was behind him with a rear naked choke set in, arms positioned with the precise geometry of someone who had practiced this specific technique approximately 10,000 times. He did not squeeze. He simply held the position and waited. 3 seconds passed. Decker tapped. The mat around them was absolutely silent. Carlos released him immediately and stood up, and the first thing he did when he stood was check Decker's face, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with the clinical attention of a man verifying that nobody had been hurt. Decker was fine. His pride was bruised in a way that would take time to sort through, but physically he was unharmed. Carlos walked back to the edge of the mat and picked up his water bottle. What happened next was either very brave or very unwise, depending on how you chose to look at it. The Marines, to their considerable credit, did not fold. They did not make excuses or walk away. They were Marines, and Marines do not easily accept conclusions they haven't personally tested. One by one, and then, in pairs, and finally, in rotating combinations, they came at Carlos Molina across those outdoor mats for the next 2.5 hours. They sent their second-best fighter after Decker. A corporal named Reyes who had trained in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for 6 years before joining the Corps. He was technically sophisticated in a way that Decker was not. He understood groundwork. He understood control. He came in with patience rather than power, and the match lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which was, by the end of the day, the longest single engagement Carlos had with any individual Marine. It ended the same way as Decker's match. Different technique, same conclusion. They sent Shaw next. Then, a young private named Howell who was so fast he was almost blinding to watch. Then, 2 of them together, which Carlos handled by keeping his back to the wall of the gymnasium building and eliminating angles. Then, 3 at once, which lasted considerably longer but reached the same destination through a route that left all 3 Marines on the mat looking at the sky and reconsidering their life choices. What the Marines were experiencing, though none of them had the vocabulary for it in that moment, was the product of 21 years of training that had nothing to do with sport and everything to do with survival. Delta Force operators do not train to win tournaments. They train for scenarios that have no rules, no referees, and no possibility of a second chance. They train to handle multiple adversaries in confined spaces while managing their own exhaustion, their own stress response, and every environmental variable simultaneously. The techniques Carlos was using had not come from a gym. They had come from basements in Baghdad, from narrow staircases in Kandahar, from rooms in places whose names were still classified. He was not fighting them. He was managing them. And that distinction, subtle as it was what Sergeant Okafor eventually named when he pulled 2 of his junior Marines aside between rotations and spoke to them in a quiet voice that carried both respect and warning. "Watch his eyes," Okafor said. "He's not reacting. He's choosing. Every single time." That observation began circulating among the Marines on the mat, and it changed the atmosphere. The challenge was still there. These were Marines. They were not going to simply stop because things were difficult, but the arrogance had begun its slow transformation into something healthier. Curiosity. Genuine respect. The desire to understand rather than simply overpower. Around the 90-minute mark, during a brief rest, Decker, who had watched every subsequent match with intense focus, walked up to Carlos and asked him directly what he had done in the army. Carlos looked at him for a moment. "Infantry," he said again. Decker shook his head slowly. "Nobody in regular infantry moves like you move." Carlos drank from his water bottle. "I said infantry," he said. "I didn't say regular." That answer landed in the group like a stone dropped in deep water. The ripples were immediate. The Marines looked at each other with the specific expression of men doing rapid mental arithmetic and arriving at a very uncomfortable sum. They had known, theoretically, that special operations forces existed. They had known, theoretically, that there were men in the American military who were trained to an entirely different standard. They had simply never been in the same room as one. More precisely, they had never been in the same room as one and known it because men like Carlos Molina made very deliberate choices about what they revealed and to whom and when. They had mistaken his silence for nothing. What it actually was everything. The second rotation began. This time the energy on the mat was different. The Marines were not trying to prove superiority anymore. They were trying to learn. They were watching his mechanics the way you watch something you want to understand, not something you want to beat. And Carlos, reading that shift with the same accuracy he read everything, adjusted accordingly. He began slowing certain moments down. He began narrating briefly, without flourish, what he was doing and why. A weight shift. A grip adjustment. The specific angle at which a wrist lock becomes irresistible to the human body's natural resistance. He was not being generous out of ego. He was being generous because he was a teacher at his core, which was something the Delta Force had made him into as surely as it had made him into everything else. You cannot operate in a 12-man unit conducting missions in denied territory without learning how to transfer knowledge under pressure, how to make other people better because your life depends on their competence. Howell, the fast private who had come the closest to landing a clean strike on Carlos during his individual rotation, crouched at the edge of the mat between exchanges and watched with an expression of absolute concentration. "How do you know where we're going before we go there?" he asked. Carlos considered the question. It was a good question. It deserved a real answer. "Your body makes a decision before your mind finishes making it," he said. "There's a loading phase, a micro-preparation that happens in your muscles before you move. Most fighters see it and react to it. That's actually too slow. You want to read the pattern that comes before the loading. The intention." Howell stared at him. "You can see intention?" "You can train yourself to," Carlos said. "Takes about 8 years." Howell sat with that for a moment. "Then, how long did it take you?" Carlos almost smiled. 6. The afternoon moved on. The sun dropped lower and the shadows lengthened across the mats and the gymnasium wall, and 12 young Marines continued to come at one man who had woken up that morning with no plan other than to observe a training assessment and be home for dinner. By the time the final rotation ended, a 3-man combination that lasted 8 minutes and left all 3 Marines on the mat for the second time that afternoon, something fundamental had changed in that outdoor space. The competitiveness was still there, because Marines do not lose competitiveness any more than they lose their own names. But something had been added to it. Something that would stay with every man present long after that day dissolved into memory. Decker sat on the edge of the mat, forearms on his knees, and looked at Carlos Molina with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the map he was using is missing an entire continent. "Who are you?" he asked. And this time the question was not a challenge. It was genuine. Carlos finished wrapping a fresh strip of tape around his left thumb, where he'd taken a glancing impact in the last rotation. He looked at Decker with steady eyes. "I'm a retired contractor," he said. "Here on a 2-week assessment." Decker shook his head. "That's not what I mean." "I know," Carlos said. He stood up, picked up his water bottle and his tape roll, and walked toward the gymnasium door. At the threshold he stopped. He did not turn around completely, just partially, just enough. "You're good," he said to Decker. "All of you are good. Better than you think. But good and great are separated by one thing." "What's that?" Decker asked. "Knowing what you don't know," Carlos said. He pushed through the gymnasium door and disappeared inside, and 12 Marine Corps fighters sat on that outdoor mat in the cooling afternoon air and let the silence settle around them the way silence settles after a thunderstorm, complete, clear, and full of something the weather itself could not have carried. None of them spoke for almost a minute. It was Shaw who finally said what they were all thinking. "We never got his name," he said. Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer. That night, in the barracks, the question of Carlos Molina's name became something of an obsession. They asked around. They asked at the contractor housing office. They got a first name and a last name which told them nothing, because it was an ordinary name for an apparently extraordinary man. It was Okafor who found something, late that evening, after making 2 phone calls to contacts who made 2 more phone calls each. He came into the barracks common room with a look on his face that his Marines would remember for a long time. His full designation, Okafor said carefully, is classified. What I can tell you is that the man you spent 3 hours trying to put on the mat today retired 14 months ago after 21 years. And I can tell you that the unit he retired from is not something you get into by being good. You get into it by being the best the Army has ever seen. The room was quiet. What unit? Decker asked. Okafor looked at him for a long moment. You already know, he said. And Decker did. They all did. Because there is only one unit in the American military that would produce a man who could stand on a mat in a white t-shirt and handle 12 trained Marine Corps fighters for 3 hours without raising his voice, without losing his temper, and without, as far as any of them could remember, showing a single genuine flicker of strain. One unit. 2 words. And the Marines fell asleep that night carrying a piece of knowledge that would permanently recalibrate something inside each of them, the understanding that the most dangerous man in any room is often the quietest one, and that silence is not the absence of power. It is, sometimes, the most concentrated form of it. The morning after changes things. Not always dramatically. Sometimes the biggest shifts happen in the small, quiet hours between sleeping and waking, when the mind finally stops defending itself and begins to actually process what it experienced. That is what happened to Travis Decker the morning after he spent an afternoon on that mat. He lay in his rack in the dark at 0430 and stared at the ceiling and thought about the moment Carlos Molina had slipped his right cross. Not the wrist lock. Not the rear naked choke. The slip. The way the man had simply not been where Decker's fist was going, without appearing to move away. Just that one motion, 2 inches of rotation, executed with a precision and an economy that Decker's body had not known was physically possible. He had thrown that punch 6,000 times. He had landed it on men his own size and men larger. And the man in the white t-shirt had made it look like Decker was throwing it in slow motion. That was the thought Decker carried with him to the morning formation. That was the thought he was still carrying at 0800 when Sergeant Okafor assembled the platoon and delivered a short speech that none of them had expected. Yesterday happened, Okafor said. He was a measured man who chose words the way a careful carpenter chooses wood, for function first, beauty second. Nobody is going to pretend it didn't. Nobody is going to make excuses about it either. What happened yesterday on those mats was a lesson. And I want every man here to understand what the lesson actually was, because if you take the wrong thing from it, it was wasted. He paused, scanning the faces of his Marines with the even attention of a man who knows each of them individually. The wrong lesson is that you're not good enough. You are good enough. You are Marine Corps infantry, and that means something real. The right lesson is that there exists a level of training and experience beyond what you have encountered, and that a man who has operated at that level for 21 years does not announce himself. He doesn't need to. You will meet men in the field, real field, not the training kind, who will not announce themselves either. And the thing that keeps you alive in those moments is exactly what yesterday cost us, the assumption that silence means ordinary. He let that sit. Do not be afraid of what you don't know, he said. Be motivated by it. There is a difference. It was, by the standard of military speeches, brief. But it landed with the specific weight that true things carry when they are delivered simply and without performance. Carlos Molina was not present for the speech. He was, at that moment, sitting in a conference room on the other side of the base with 3 senior officers, presenting his training assessment findings in the flat, technical language of a man who spent his career writing reports about situations that could not be described in normal human vocabulary. He had 12 pages of observation notes on the platoon's close-quarters training methodology, their tactical communication patterns, their decision-making under physical stress. It was a thorough assessment. A professional one. He had not mentioned the events of the previous afternoon in his report. That was not oversight. That was deliberate. What had happened on the mat was not part of his professional assignment. It was personal, not in the sense of being emotional or significant to him, but in the sense that it belonged to those 12 young men in a way that a formal assessment document had no right to touch. What they had learned, they needed to own entirely. A report that named it and filed it and gave it official language would have taken something from them. Carlos understood that with the same clarity he understood most things, quietly, completely, without ceremony. After the briefing he walked back across the base in the October morning air, and, somewhere between the conference building and the contractor housing, he was intercepted by Decker. The young Marine was off duty, in civilian clothes, which somehow made him look less formidable, though objectively he was the same person. He fell into step beside Carlos without asking permission, which was either confidence or the last remnant of the kind of forward manner that had started the whole episode. Carlos did not break stride. "I wanted to ask you something," Decker said. "Go ahead." "Yesterday, when we were on the mat. At the end, when you were slowing things down and explaining. You didn't have to do that." "No," Carlos agreed. "Why did you?" Carlos walked a few more steps before answering. "Because you were asking the right questions by then," he said. "Not with your mouth. With how you were moving. You were trying to understand rather than just trying to win. That's worth responding to." Decker absorbed this. "When did you know?" he asked. "When did you know what you were going to do when you walked onto that mat?" "Before I walked onto it," Carlos said. "Before you knew who you'd be fighting?" "Before I met any of you," Carlos said. "I knew what I was capable of. The variables were about you, not me." This was not arrogance. Decker recognized that, standing there on the paved path in the October air. It was the same way a master electrician might explain that he doesn't wonder whether he can wire a house. He knows he can, because he has done it hundreds of times. The wondering is about the specific house, the specific complications, the specific materials. Carlos Molina had spent 21 years in situations where his survival depended on accurate self-assessment. A man in that world who overestimates himself dies. A man who underestimates himself also dies. The only viable option was precision, knowing exactly what he could do, what he could not do, and what the margin between those two things looked like. "Is that something you can learn?" Decker asked. "That kind of knowing yourself like that?" Carlos stopped walking. He turned and looked at Decker with full attention, the kind of attention he gave very few things and very few people, the kind that made the recipient feel briefly and unexpectedly visible in a very specific way. "That," he said, "is the entire point of the training. Not the techniques. Not the physical conditioning. The point is learning to see yourself accurately. Most people spend their lives seeing themselves through the filter of what they want to be true. The training strips the filter. It takes a long time and it is not comfortable." Decker held his gaze. "How long?" "Different for everyone." Carlos looked at him for a moment with the brief, reading attention of a man reviewing a document. "You might be faster than most. You adjusted mid-fight, which means your ego doesn't own you completely. That's the hard part for most young fighters. You've already cleared it." "Partially." Decker said nothing for a moment. "Then, you're evaluating me right now." "I'm always evaluating," Carlos said. "It's not something I turn off." "Is that?" Decker stopped and chose his next word with unusual care for a 22-year-old. "Is that lonely?" Carlos looked at him for a beat longer than expected. It was a question nobody had asked him in a very long time. It was, in fact, a question that cut closer to something real than most of the combat-oriented conversation he had participated in across 2 decades of professional violence. "Sometimes," he said. "Yes." He started walking again. Decker walked with him a few more steps and then stopped, because he could sense the conversation had reached its natural border, the place where two people have exchanged exactly what was supposed to be exchanged and anything further would be excess. "Thank you," Decker said. "For yesterday." Carlos did not turn around. "Thank yourself," he said. "You kept getting up." He kept walking, and Decker watched him go, and the rest of the base moved around them, both in the ordinary business of a military morning, formations and briefings and vehicles, and the distant sound of something mechanical running on a training range somewhere over the hill. The story of that afternoon on the mats spread through Camp Pendleton the way stories spread in military installations, rapidly, with embellishments accumulating like barnacles. By the end of the week, the number of Marines had grown to 15 in some versions. In others, Carlos had submitted 2 of them to joint locks simultaneously. One version had him fighting blindfolded, which was entirely fictional but said something accurate about the general impression he had left. Sergeant Okafor heard the various versions circulating and said nothing to correct them. He understood that the exaggeration was the story's way of communicating something true, that what they had witnessed was legitimately extraordinary, and that the human mind, lacking precise technical vocabulary for that kind of excellence, reaches for scale instead. What Okafor did do was something more useful. He made 2 phone calls and secured approval to have a 3-day hand-to-hand combat intensive added to the platoon's training schedule, led by a Marine Corps instructor who had cross-trained with Army Special Operations. Not to replicate what Carlos had done that was not replicable in 3 days, or 30 days, or perhaps a decade. But to begin a conversation that the afternoon on the mats had opened. To give his Marines a more sophisticated framework for understanding what elite close-quarters capability actually looks like, and what it takes to pursue it seriously. Decker signed up for every optional session the instructor offered. So did Howell. So did Reyes, who had already started downloading academic papers on biomechanics and human movement theory, which was not the kind of thing he had ever done before. Something had been activated in them. That is the most accurate way to describe it. Not humiliation, none of them felt humiliated in the destructive, self-diminishing sense. Something closer to revelation. The sudden understanding that there was a room they had not yet entered, that the room existed, that the door was not locked. Only difficult. Carlos finished his 2-week assessment on a Thursday morning. He packed his bag, turned in his contractor badge, and signed the departure paperwork in the administrative office with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He shook hands with the 3 senior officers he had briefed. He stopped in the mess hall for one last cup of black coffee. He was about to walk to the parking lot when Okafor caught him. The sergeant was in full uniform, and he stopped Carlos with a hand extended not for a handshake but open, flat, the gesture of a man who wants a moment, not a transaction. Carlos stopped. "I just wanted you to know," Okafor said, "what happened on that mat is going to stay with those young men for the rest of their careers. Not as a bruise. As a standard." Carlos considered this. "That's up to them," he said. "I know," Okafor said. "I think they understand that now too." They shook hands. 2 men who had spent their careers doing things that most people would never know about, standing on a base in California in the October morning, exchanging a few honest words about what it means to train a young person towards something real. Carlos drove off the base at 0947. The gate guard waved him through without ceremony. The California morning was clear and blue and warm in the specific way that California mornings are warm, like something that does not need to announce itself. Travis Decker was promoted to corporal 8 months later. He was selected 2 years after that for an accelerated scout sniper program. He eventually went on to serve 3 combat tours. In interviews he gave years later, when asked what single experience most shaped how he approached his military career, he consistently gave an answer that surprised people. He did not name a battle. He did not name a commanding officer. He did not name any moment from a deployment. He named a Tuesday evening at a base recreation center, where he had walked up to a quiet older man in the corner and made the kind of assumption that lives are sometimes built on. And the 3 hours that followed, which removed that assumption from him permanently and replaced it with something far more durable. "I thought I knew what dangerous looked like," he said in one such interview. "Turns out dangerous looks like nothing. Looks like a man reading a book. Looks like somebody who doesn't need you to know." He paused there, the way people pause when they are saying the exact true thing rather than the easy approximate thing. The scariest people I've ever met in my life, he said, were the quietest ones. Carlos Molina went back to his contractor work. He went back to his 4 hours of sleep and his early mornings and his Cormac McCarthy novels and the particular quality of silence that surrounds a man who carries a great deal and shows none of it. He completed 11 more assessment contracts over the next 3 years. He trained at a private gym twice a week, not to maintain anything in particular, but because his body had been trained for so long that stillness felt foreign to it. He never went back to Camp Pendleton. He did not need to. The lesson he had delivered there, without planning to deliver it, without any intention other than to drink coffee and read a book, had already done exactly what lessons do when they land in the right soil. It had grown. 12 men had walked onto a mat that October afternoon believing they knew their own capacity and the capacity of the man standing across from them. They walked off it carrying the only knowledge that ever leads anywhere truly worth going, the knowledge of how much they did not yet know. And one man drove home on a clear October morning with his water bottle in the cup holder and his tape roll on the passenger seat, and if he thought about those 12 young Marines at all during that drive, he thought of them the way a good teacher thinks of a classroom after a day that went better than planned. Not with pride. With something quieter than pride. With the simple satisfaction of a job, an accidental, unplanned, entirely unscheduled job that had been done right.